Hello, this is Andrew with Mammalian.bike, and this is a Bryton Rider 320 cycling computer. The 320 fits pretty solidly into the mid-range of cycling computers. That is a pretty broad segment though, so we're going to talk just briefly about what this can do, but let's get it open first. So on the side of the box you can kind of get a little bit of an idea of what it is. It's a 2.3-inch optically bonded display, which solves one of the issues with the 410, which is that it wasn't flat, and so sometimes you could get shadows across the screen. That didn't bother me, but some reviewers found that to be super annoying. So let's get this bad boy out. Included here we have a heart rate strap. This is, I should probably point out, this is the Rider 320T, which includes the sensor bundle kit, which is why the heart rate sensor is there and why the cadence sensor is here. And then we have our mount for the, that's a stem or handlebar mount, a micro USB charging cable, some instructions, and then the device itself. Interestingly enough, there is a place for a tether, but I don't see a tether included in the collection of stuff here. So if you're interested in tethering the computer to your bike, which personally I very much am, you'll have to DIY that bad boy. But I could be missing it in here. If I do, then I will definitely make sure that we update the review to include that. Let's get the dimensions. Okay, so length, we have 83.4. Width, we have 49.8. And then height, including the mount, is 21.2. Weight-wise, 67.8, and I believe that Bryton claims 67 grams, so it's a little bit overweight, but 0.8 is probably not the worst thing that can happen. For reference, we have a Garmin 520 Plus, a Wahoo Element Bolt, and then a Garmin Edge 530 here, just to kind of see the size comparison. It's probably closest in size to the 530. 520 is a little bit smaller. You can see that. And then the Bolt, Element Bolt, is even smaller still. So that's the size comparison. And the buttons on the bottom, we have power and looks like brightness. This is the pause, stop, and back button. And then there's two buttons on the sides, that one is to page and one is to do OK and lap. So let's fire this up and see if we have some charge in it. So it does. Sorry about that glare. So let's just quickly walk through the setup, English. So let's talk about sensors while this is starting itself up. So the Bryton 320 supports heart rate, cadence, and power meters. But interestingly enough, the power meter only works over ANT+. It doesn't work over Bluetooth, which means that if you have a power meter that only does Bluetooth, you're not going to be able to use this to get power data. It also does not support electronic shifting. That is a premium feature that is only available on higher end Bryton models. Also lacking, I believe, is support for smart trainers. The ability to, you should be able to pull power off of a smart trainer over ANT+, but the ability to control it over ANT FEC, I believe is the protocol, and definitely not Bluetooth, obviously. Okay, so we have our device started up. So let's just quickly add a few sensors to it. So I press this button, this stops the pause, stop, and back button to get this screen. I'm going to go down and go to settings, But before moving to the next section, I do want to make sure that we have our data set up to do 1 second recording. I'm not sure why, like Garmin is really bad about this, but Garmin ships in the smart record. I don't know why they do that. Well, actually I do know why they do it. It's a legacy thing because storage used to be expensive, but now it is so cheap that there's really no reason why you shouldn't just leave it at 1 second or set it to 1 second. So if you have a Garmin, make sure you check that because you're losing data if you don't have it on 1 second. So let's go back and let's go to our sensors just to get a couple of those set up. So heart rate, I am wearing a heart rate sensor right now. So I get my heart rate, but I would prefer if I could just add all the sensors at once. There we go. So back. So we have our heart rate and power set up. I should get cadence from the power meter, but if I were using a cadence sensor, that's when I would do that now. Actually, let's go into general real quick, just to see what's there. System. All right, I'm going to turn up the ketones because I don't like that. So that is all set up. We have, oh yeah, so added cadence, actually changed the data page around. That's really nice. Heart rate, cadence, power. I'll mess with the pages on the phone so that we can set it up that way because it's just easier to do it there than it is to do it on the device itself. So before digging into the final thoughts for the Bryton Rider 320, I want to say thank you to Bryton for sending me the 320 or the 320T. This review would not have been possible if they had not, so thank you, Bryton. So let's talk about the form factor. I like the form factor. I think it's really good. I think it's a good improvement over the 410. It's very, very similar to the 420, almost identical, in fact, to the 420. It's easy to use, easy to live with, and I have only one complaint, and that is that the charging port is underneath the device instead of at the bottom of the head unit, so you can't charge it while you can charge it while you're using it, you can't actually get to the port while you're using it on a bike mount. That said, you probably won't need to charge it while you're using it because the battery life is amazing. I got almost 16 hours of moving time. Now this was with two sensors, a heart rate sensor and a power sensor which provides power and cadence. So the more sensors you have, the bigger the penalty for battery life. So let's just say, having said that, almost 16 hours of moving time, almost 20 hours of on time for about 470 miles worth of riding, which is pretty awesome. That said, if battery life is your biggest concern, then the Rider 420 actually has better battery life. I have a review unit in here. I just haven't completed the review yet. It gets 25 hours of moving time and almost 32 hours of on time I did about 690 miles in that time. So with the same set of sensors, heart rate and power / cadence. So that is the battery champ. And it's kind of funny with the Garmin 1030 Plus coming out, and they're saying, oh, they can get 24 hours of battery life, and that's a great thing. Now, obviously, they're not apples to apples, but Bryton does that with the 420 easy, and it approaches awesome battery life with the 320, much better than the 530 that I use. So amazing. The screen is really easy to see. I had no issues at all looking down and seeing it, bright sunlight and shading or whatever. Obviously, your mileage will vary. So I think that, but I would have no concerns with the way that the screen is designed and looking at it compared to other bike computers that I've used. I think the screen is great. The device itself is fast and responsive. It boots up so fast. I'm going to put a video here. We can just count it down and we're done. And when you're using it, you just go from page to page and you get the data that you want to get, and you get it pretty quickly. The mobile base setup is really nice. I have a little video running here demonstrating that. Hopefully you can see how you do it, but it will be going pretty fast. So if you have any questions or whatever, hit me up below and I will try to get to them. It does text, call, and app notifications. Sometimes the app notifications aren't exactly what you want them to be, but that's not really Bryton's fault. That's just how notifications work, at least on my Android phone. I didn't test it with an iOS device because I don't have an iOS device that has that I can put a SIM card in to use in the US. But it's great that it works. The only complaint I have around that is that I wish that the phone notification would show me the phone number instead of just that there's a phone call. While I'm complaining, I would prefer if the battery indicator was a percentage instead of just a little battery icon. It's really hard to know if that is 50%, 33%, 25%, or if I'm heading out with something where it's going to die on the way. So percentage would be a little bit more useful. If it exists on the device, I didn't find it. So if it's there and somebody finds it, let me know and I will apologize profusely. I don't like it that there's no ANT plus radar. I see that as a safety feature. I think it's just super important. Obviously, that is a matter of opinion. So if you don't use radar or you think it's stupid, then that's not a concern. It also doesn't do Di2 or other electronic shifting formats or ANT plus lights. I mean, I understand, at least with Di2, that's a higher end feature. So it totally makes sense that 320, which is a $120 computer, wouldn't have that. It's consistent with the other computers in its range when it comes to Di2. And then, of course, with lights, nobody does lights except Garmin. The other thing that I don't like is that I can't get the watts per kilo or specific power, as Bryton calls it, in anything but instantaneous. And personally, my preference is to use 10-second watt per kilo, but even like a 30-second watt per kilo would be better than instantaneous. Instantaneous fluctuates all over the place, and it's just not, at least in my opinion, an awesome metric on which to judge where you are for pacing with your power. So I would like to see, maybe in a future software revision or whatever, more granularity to control averages around watts per kilo. The other power numbers, great. 3-second, 10-second, 30-second, and then all kinds of like balance and average balance and torque numbers and whatever. All of that stuff, brilliant, works great. Add them to your other pages, watch it, perfect. One of the other things is bike profiles. So this is kind of a 6 of one, half a dozen of another kind of thing. My personal feeling is that I prefer like a giant pool of sensors, and I just add my sensors, and then whatever bike I'm using, it just kind of sorts that out, so I don't have to change the bike profile. On Bryton, you have 2 bike profiles, so you can set them up with their own discrete sets of sensors. And if you have 2 bikes, that works great, and you don't mind swapping it, that works great. It also works great if you have 2 bikes and you, like, my son's the same size as I am, so he rides one of my bikes when we go riding, and if the sensors on there were in the big pool of sensors, then it could cause confusion on the head unit, and I wouldn't even know. On my head unit, and I wouldn't even know. With bike profiles, you solve that problem. And so that's where that 6 of one, half a dozen cuts the other way, where it's actually very useful to have them in that scenario. There's also Active, which is essentially the app, but on the web. So I think of the app, the mobile app, is probably just a thin wrapper around the Active website, which, it's a very convenient and quick way to write web apps, but it does make the mobile app a little bit sluggish compared to other, like a native app would be. But you get pretty much the same experience if you go to the website versus what you see on the mobile app. And you see useful metrics like power and speed and cadence, heart rate, all that stuff, either on the web or in the mobile app. So it's really great that Bryton provides that. some other vendors don't. And at this price point, it's especially great because I think if there is a user that doesn't have Strava, then having it here, having something available there is fantastic. Which I should also point out that you do have third-party integration. So Strava is there. There's a few other Training Peaks integrations as well. You will want to check to make sure that the integration that you want is included with their third-party integration suite. So, but Strava's there, and that's the big one. So here we have 3 fit files recorded with a Garmin 520 Plus, a Wahoo Element Bolt, and the Bryton 320. Here we can see a map kind of outlines the ride, and then below that we have a breakdown of the different data points. The most interesting data points here are the elevation, and we can see here that they all 3 have different, they all kind of follow the same trend lines, but they all have different numbers. With, I think, given that Chicago, which is roughly where this ride took place, is about 180 meters above sea level, that the Bryton probably is the most correct, but without really digging into it, I'm not sure that it's possible for me to say which is right. Interestingly enough, the elevation itself is the most, even though the basic trend line, as we can see, is pretty much exactly the same. So my guess is that the Bryton at a more micro level is seeing more change, and that's why it adds up to what it is, even though the lines themselves are relatively consistent across the 3 head units. So this is an up and back ride, so we're going to see a few different lines. There's an interesting place that I wanted to look at. Well, actually, let's just start here. This is out on Sheridan Road. I was riding on the road here, and as we can see, all 3 of the lines are pretty close, with the Garmin being probably the closest one because I was actually riding on the road, not next to it. There's one section I wanted to look in a little more detail because it adds some complexity to the mix. There's a section of Sheridan where you're not allowed to ride on the road anymore. You have to go on the bike path. And you can see here where I get on the bike path going north. Again, it's important to note that this is an up and back ride, so there should be more lines here than you would expect to see. If we draw really close in, we can see that nobody really nails the bike path. Nobody's really on it. This is a heavily wooded bike path in this section, so that kind of explains why there might be some difficulty there around the GPS signal, receiving the GPS signal on the bike. But we can see here that the Bryton, in one path, the Bryton 320 and the Garmin are in total agreement, with the Bolt kind of a little bit closer on either side of the bike path. And then on the other leg, the Garmin's like way out somewhere, who knows. And the Bryton is doing much better at coping. So of the 3, in this scenario, in the heavily wooded bike path, the Element does the best. The Garmin doesn't do very well at all, and the Bryton's kind of in the middle. Going a little bit farther north, we get back on the road, and now we can see that they're all kind of hanging pretty well to see if we have to really zoom in to see any differences here. If we really zoom in, we can see that the Bryton and the Element are kind of off the right side of the road on one trip, with the Garmin on the left side of the road for both trips, and then the Bryton and the Element kind of off in no man's land on the other side. So none of the 3 really nails the experience, which is, it's interesting. I don't know that it really makes that much of a difference, but it is worth noting that there are sections where one unit seems to do better than the other, and then on the other section where a different unit handles whatever the condition is a little bit better. If we go down and look at the temperature, the Bryton and Garmin seem to have pretty close agreement on the averages for the ride. The Bolt is just kind of flatlined, where the Bryton and the Garmin seem to recognize a little bit more change in temperature. And then finally the speed. Everybody agrees. So, and this is like I stopped using a speed sensor on my bike a while back because Strava doesn't care about speed sensors. So why should I? And so it's really nice to see that the average speed for the ride, all three computers completely agree. And as we can see here, the trend line is super close. So I would say that all in, except for the kind of weirdness around elevation, but that's probably just an implementation detail between the three different computers, how they measure elevation, with the Bryton probably being, at least from a trending perspective, the most correct. I think it's clear that there's not a whole lot of difference between them. So hopefully you found that useful. If you did, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, or you think I missed something, just let me know below and I will get to it as soon as I can. Thanks.